Good evening and welcome to Your Idaho, where we discuss the issues facing our state and its citizens. This program is brought to you by the GemStatePatriot.com, an Idaho-based electronic newsletter. My name is Bob Neugebauer. I'm your host for this evening, and I'd like to introduce our special guest, who is sitting on my left, John Bujak, the Libertarian candidate for governor. John, it's a pleasure to have you here this evening, and thanks for taking time out of your busy schedule to see us. I'd kind of like to start this evening off by asking you why you decided to run for governor.
Sure, Bob, and thank you for having me on the program. I decided to run for governor because of a problem that I saw in Idaho politics back when I was the Canyon County prosecutor. In particular, I noticed that government wasn't run by the people and for the people, but rather it was run to serve what I call the good old boys, those who have special political influence or those who have enough money that they can hire lobbyists to be heard. I watched government not be responsive to the people and recognized that something had to be done. And so after I finished my time as the prosecutor in Canyon County and fighting the good old boys for 3 years, I decided it was the right time for me to throw my hat in the ring and run for governor.
Just kind of curious, why do you think you're the best man to do this job?
I'll tell you, government in general and elected office in particular is not a place for the faint of heart. It's a blood sport, and I've heard it called riding the tiger on a number of occasions, and that's really true. I know how government works. I've been a lawyer for a long time, more than a decade. I've worked within the system to help people, and more importantly, over the last 3 years, I fought against the good old boys within the system, and I've won. So I know how government works. I know how to operate within the system to get things done, and I know how to take down what has become the good old boy establishment at the top of the pyramid here in Idaho.
You've had some problems in the most recent past with Canyon County while you were the prosecutor. I don't believe you've ever had a real chance to tell your part of the story to the citizens of Idaho. Could you give the audience a quick rundown on how and why all these charges were brought against you and how the charges were eventually resolved?
Absolutely, Bob. When I was the elected prosecutor, I had an aggressive agenda. One of the things I wanted to do was bring all of the prosecution in Canyon County under one roof so we could take advantage of an economy of scale and save the taxpayers a bunch of money. One of the things I decided to do in that vein was to ask the county commissioners for permission to bid on the Napa prosecution contract. Again, Napa had been run by a private firm at a premium cost for a long time. Idaho law allows an elected prosecutor with the unanimous approval of the county commissioners to bid on those contracts and take them in-house. So the county commissioners gave me permission. I bid on the contract. My bid was much lower than the private firm, and we saved the taxpayers a bunch of money. Through the economy of scale, we improved economically the benefits of the prosecutor's office and also created a better prosecution model for both the citizens in Napa and for the county. Well, there was a group of people within the community led by the firm who had lost the contract to me during the bidding process who decided that they didn't like the fact that government was able to compete with the private sector. And as a general rule, I agree with that premise. But in this case, with the legal mechanism in place to allow me to do what I was doing, and for the simple reason we were able to give better service for a better price, it made sense. But as the community got riled up, as this law firm continued to push, the issue became a political hot potato, and the county commissioners decided to throw me under the bus, basically. They claimed at the end that they never gave me permission to have this contract, when in fact, on numerous occasions on the public record, they voiced that they had. So they ended up forcing me to resign from office. The issue was they would let me stay in office and I would lose the Napa contract, or I could leave office and they would allow the Napa contract to remain with the prosecutor's office. I made the choice to step down because the salaries of my deputies in the prosecutor's office, some of them up to 30% of their salaries, were being funded by that Napa contract. So I stepped down, and then that started the 3-year witch hunt where charge after charge was levied against me. And I went to trial on every one. It was 5 trials in 3 years. And at the end of the day, the people, in the form of the juries, heard the evidence and acquitted me of the charges. And as I stand here today running for office as governor, I've been cleared of any wrongdoing.
So I understand the Bar Association has also cleared you of any problems.
During the period of time I was going through the problems, they asked me to agree to an interim suspension of my license. But after the state court charges were cleared, my license was restored to me by the Supreme Court, and I'm currently licensed to practice law in the state.
Was there any settlement at the end of this process with Canyon County?
You know, part of this process took us through the bankruptcy court system, and the trustee in charge of my case went after Canyon County for money that the trustee said was owed to me for the Napa contract. At the end of the day, Canyon County settled with my estate, paying it $100,000.
So you're a man who was thrown under the bus, fought all of these lawsuits, and actually came out kind of like smelling like a rose.
In some respects, and I think, again, the lesson you take away from this is, one, it's pretty scary what the good old boys can do with you when they put a target on your back. And number two, you can trust in the people of Idaho to do the right thing. And of course, they stood as a buffer between me and the awesome power of both the state and the federal government.
I can see that, and I know I still see an awful lot of people out there who are skeptical, but I wanted to get this out so that people would actually have an opportunity to hear it from your mouth rather than from what I call the skewed media within this state. What do you think the biggest challenges are going to be for the next governor of the state?
I can tell you right now, Idaho is at a crossroads. You know, the current governor has taken us so far down the wrong path at this point that if we don't change course, Idaho's in big trouble. There are really two huge challenges on the horizon for Idaho, the way I see it. And both of them involve limiting federal control and federal dollars from coming into the state. One thing we have to do is absolutely stop this Obamacare train that has started to run through our state. Unfortunately, Governor Otter stopped fighting, and we now have a health insurance exchange here in Idaho. But I tell you, if Governor Otter remains in office, we're going to see him start pushing for Medicaid expansion, and that's a big mistake. That's the number one thing. The other thing is, you watch government come into this state and affect our education system through these Common Core standards, and there are new Common Core standards on the horizon. And we have to make sure we stand strong as a state not to let those new standards be adopted by our legislature, and to do what we can to reverse the adoption that really was advanced by our legislature because, in my opinion, they were fooled. They were sold a bill of goods that just simply wasn't the truth. Those are two of the biggest issues that are on the horizon facing Idaho citizens.
What do you think our economy, our economy's been very slow growth for the last 8 years, and do you think this was just because of the 2009 recession, or was it more to do with bad management?
You know, you can't ignore the recession as a factor. Clearly that was a factor. But what's different watching Idaho this time around, because we've had other recessions here in Idaho, usually Idaho is one of the states that leads the way out. And that hasn't happened this time around, and that's a management issue. And I'll tell you what's going wrong in Idaho from an economy standpoint is, again, really two things. One, we're limited in what we can harvest from our natural resources because we don't have control of enough of our lands. And when you look at other states that are doing well, like for example Texas or North Dakota, one of the things that they have in common is they're allowed to harvest and export energy. And Idaho has a lot of energy reserves in its natural lands that it can't access because the federal government controls those lands. So one key to improving our economy is getting control of those lands back from the federal government so we can realize the benefits of the natural resources and the energy that's there. The other thing is we have to change our tax structure in Idaho and our regulatory structure. You know, the good old boys, again, led by Governor Otter, they give all these benefits to big companies, but they don't give any benefits to smaller companies here in Idaho and established companies here in Idaho. Taxes, they need to be low and predictable, and they need to be fair across the board. And one thing, you talk about the issues facing the state. There's a lot of things that the Idaho government has to pay for. And the percentage of the budget within Idaho is pretty well established. There has to be a bigger pie. And the way you grow that pie without raising taxes on everyday Idahoans is to make sure the tax base is fair. And that's something else we're going to have to deal with going forward.
Well, I keep hearing about Idaho being in very good condition on some of the commercials that are out there right now. But I have to think that any state who's garnering 38-39% of their budget from the federal government at some point in time is going to have some serious problems if there are cutbacks from the federal side. Would you deal with that? I mean, would you start to try and cut back on those government payments?
Absolutely, and that's a really good point because Idaho relies way too heavily on federal dollars. And of course, with every dollar we take, there's some regulation or string that's attached to that money when we receive it. You know, the regulation kills a lot of the benefits that that money could have here in the state. If we don't wean ourselves away from those federal dollars, we're in big trouble.
You know, one of our problems here in Idaho is we have some of the highest numbers of minimum wage jobs in the country. What would you do to improve the economy and bring better paying jobs to Idaho? And again, what do you think the role of government should be in this arena in terms of picking winners and losers?
I'll tell you, government in general, when it comes to business and private enterprise, needs to get out of the way. That's the most important thing government can do. I mean, one thing that's just very clear when you look at the data, private business thrives when government regulation and government taxes are low. And that ought to be the agenda of the government. Now you say, how can we lower taxes when we need money to fund some of the programming? In particular, you hear a lot about we need to fund more education dollars. But really, again, that deals with making the tax structure fair. And you talk about bringing better paying jobs to Idaho, you don't do that by bringing in the mega corporations who are just here to take advantage of tax incentives. You need to start rebuilding the communities, and communities are built around small businesses. Small businesses have loyalty toward the people who work for them. They want to take care of them. They want to pay livable wages. Big corporations don't care. They look at a workforce as a commodity. People are commodities. They're interchangeable parts. There's no loyalty, and they're going to get away with the cheapest labor they can find.
Thank you. As far as you mentioned Medicaid expansion and how this legislature really has been kind of wishy-washy on the issue. How do you feel about Medicaid expansion, and would you be willing to look at alternatives, and which ones?
You know, I absolutely am against Medicaid expansion. And I'll tell you, this is the big fallacy of the way the Republicans and the Democrats are looking at the problem right now. They think the way you solve any problem is you throw more dollars at it. And that simply isn't the answer. You can throw as many dollars as you want at a broken model, and it isn't going to fix the problem. What we have right now in a healthcare model is broken, and it needs to be replaced. And I'll tell you, I saw a presentation. Senator Thane put it on down at the State House, and he talks about direct primary care with a wraparound insurance for catastrophic care contingencies that makes a lot of sense to me. If you do something like that, where you make primary care affordable and you make it accessible to people, that makes a lot more sense than just throwing a bunch of dollars at a system that can't take care of the Medicaid folks that are already needing primary care in the community. Let's stop sending these people to the emergency rooms at the hospital. Let's stop wasting 40% of that money on regulation and paperwork, and let's put it to work to provide quality, direct primary care to people. That makes a heck of a lot more sense to me.
What would you do? One of our big problems here in Idaho is there very little transparency in costs of medical care. What would you do to increase and improve on that transparency?
You know, one problem with the transparency issue is, again, this good old boy network that goes on. And one of the good old boys is the hospitals here in Idaho, the healthcare industry in general. Huge amounts of dollars, huge amounts of lobbying. Even when you look at, for example, Governor Otter's committee that he put together on Medicaid expansion, they have legislators in there, and then they have people from this healthcare community. The legislators say, we don't want Medicaid expansion. The special interests that stand to make a lot of money off of this, they all want Medicaid expansion. That's no surprise. The only way you're going to increase transparency, again, is to change the model and the way those dollars are delivered. These kinds of deals can't be cut in the back room between the government through the Medicaid process to these primary providers who are just interested in making a buck.
We've got a very strong lobby group here in Idaho. The Idaho Association for Industry and Commerce is part of that lobby group. They have an awful lot of influence and power within our political system. And it's kind of funny that we are one of the few states who actually have a lobbyist room in the State House, or they call them legislative aides. Would you do anything to eliminate that group from the State House and kind of push them out where they belong? And give that room back to the citizens where they can meet with their legislators.
Again, you talk about the State House, it's always referred to as the people's house, and that's really what it ought to be. Lobbyists, I don't see anything good that they bring to the legislative process or to government in general. They're there because people have a lot of money to hire them to be there. And a couple things if I'm governor. One, the lobbyists are not going to have my ear. They're not going to be welcome in the people's house. And as far as having some space set aside for them, right now I think they're there because, for example, with IACI, like you mentioned, they're just an arm of Otter's campaign. Jason Ronk, he worked for IACI, now he's leading the governor's campaign. It's all one incestuous, corrupt club there. And that machine needs to be disassembled if we're going to have an Idaho government that makes sense for the people.
Let's get back to Common Core standards. Would you be willing to take a good hard look at those standards and be willing to change them legislatively so that we don't have to deal with the federal inflection on our school's education program and bring it more to a local board, teacher, and parent level as to what's going to be taught in our schools?
I absolutely would support that move, and this is why. The federal government right now through Common Core, they're not educating our kids, in my opinion. They're indoctrinating our kids. They're bringing these federal ideas and federal standards into the classroom so that our kids are taught to think and believe in a certain way. And that's not the Idaho way. We at a local level in Idaho need to set the standards and need to teach our kids the truth. I look at these science standards that they're coming down the pipe with, and it's amazing to me. They just, as foregone conclusion, state things as fact when they haven't been established by the scientific community. And so our kids end up being kind of brainwashed through the process. Of course, in addition, we're reporting a bunch of information on our kids to the federal government that they really have no business knowing. They don't need that information on our Idaho children in order that they be educated. So Common Core, it just needs to go. It's terrible in its inception, terrible in its form. It's another one of these models that's broken and needs to be replaced with something that's established and generated at the local level, maybe at the district level.
Well, Common Core is a one-size-fits-all, and we have a very diversified economy here in Idaho, and a lot of it goes to vocational training, more so than it does to the four-year college situation. What would you do to improve the vocational choices of the students that aren't interested in attending a four-year college?
Well, one thing you hear about Governor Otter talking about is his K through career program. He's always, he wants kids to go on to college, and there's nothing wrong with college education. Again, the data shows the more education people have, the more they tend to earn. But that career path isn't for everybody. And I think that there needs to be an alternative career path for people who aren't going to go down that road to allow them to earn sustainable wages and support their family here in Idaho. Because right now there's really no program, no path for them to follow, and that needs to be developed.
That's interesting. My daughter goes to CWI. She's going to become a physical therapist at some point in time. The problem is that she would have to take off work and go there full time. Which is almost impossible to raise the family, supply the needs of the family. Both her and her husband work. Would there be a way to make it easier for those who are going for an education program like this to break that up so that they didn't have to take off that 4 years or 2 years or whatever it was, and they could continue to work but still start learning how they would deal with the new profession and get their education background?
Well, I'd like to see, there's a whole history behind, education and licensing, and there's some issues with licensing in Idaho too. But one thing that's become discounted over the years that I think we need to take a stronger look at is the notion of being a journeyman or being an apprentice and getting some credit towards your education for having real world experience out in the marketplace. Not only can you learn the trade from somebody in a practical sense, because there's always a translation from book learning to what you do in real life out when you're performing a service for somebody. If you can add that into the curriculum in a way where they're providing a service, they could even earn a wage while they're doing that and make that part of the education program, and that they could get credit from that process in addition to the time they spend in the classroom. I'd like to see that kind of a model put into place, especially in our community colleges.
So you're talking about an on-the-job education?
Indeed.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to hit a couple of more things before we run out of time here. we have been told that we have a problem with our roads, bridges, infrastructure, etc. But when they did a survey, 63 to 65% of the people said they didn't think there was a problem. Now, I drive all around the state many, many months of the year, except during the wintertime. There is a number out there of $200 and some odd million to redo and refix the roads and bridges in Idaho. And that's going to entail finding more money. And we already can't find enough money to do the things we have. If it came to having to do this, would you do it over a period of time? And how would you find the money to do that? Because they've talked about a gas tax, a mileage tax, taxing fuel-efficient cars at the point of sale. Where would you go with this?
All right. First of all, as I've traveled the state campaigning, that's one issue that I haven't heard one time from the grassroots folks around the state. So, my initial thoughts on this issue is I'm not so sure there isn't some road construction company that's a friend of Governor Otter's who stands to make a lot of money if they implement this, let's rebuild the roads in Idaho. I've heard a lot about education, I've heard a lot about the economy, I've heard a lot about Medicaid expansion. I bet you I haven't heard from two people that the roads need to have something done. And in fact, one of the two times that it came up, they wondered why they were spending so much time repairing roads that didn't seem to need to be repaired. So that's one observation as I've gone around the state. If we decided we had to fix the roads, if it really is an issue and the data supported that, I don't think you need to raise taxes to do that. When I look at the government structure in Idaho, I see a lot of fat in the budget, and I don't think it's run very efficiently. Now, you talk about, again, percentages of the budget that go to different locations. 65% goes to education, 20% goes to medical, leaves 15% left over for other things. I think we need to take a close look at how we're spending money, how the state spends money. A good example is, Governor Otter going and asking for $1 million to fight this gay marriage issue. It's a battle he just simply can't win. I mean, even Republican governors in other states like Nevada saw the wisdom in backing out of the fight because the writing's on the wall on this one. I think we need to stop throwing money away on projects that we shouldn't be spending money on, cut the fat from the budget, and look to shuffle those funds around within the existing budget before we look at raising taxes.
Something that came up in the last legislative session, there were 30 sponsors of a bill to eliminate the grocery tax. How would you feel about that?
I think that's a great idea. I spent some time talking with Senator Fulcher about that issue at a breakfast recently, and understanding how they'd structured that plan to eliminate the grocery tax. It seems like it's not money that we'd have to make up someplace else, and it's just a good idea to end that tax. And again, what I'd like to see Idaho move to is some kind of fair, flat tax at some level. I don't think we need to be taxing everything every time we turn around. Let's just take some fair measure of taxes from everyone. That's our budget, and let's operate within that budget here within the state of Idaho.
Well, when I first moved here, I was kind of surprised that they had that schedule of increasing taxes as your wages go up, because that's very much like the way New York does it and New Jersey does it. So you would actually come up with a flat tax or a fair tax? Or
Absolutely. And people wonder, well, how can you do that? We're not going to have enough money if you do that. I hear that argument sometimes when I go around the state. But the reason, if you look at the data on this, is because there's so many tax breaks for the people that make the most money, including big business. If everybody paid their fair share, we'd be just fine.
How would you deal with the problems that we're going to have with the abortion issue and the Affordable Care Act, particularly the morning after pill and several others that are quite onerous in terms of our pro-life people here in Idaho?
This is one of the most difficult issues for me personally. I'm personally pro-life, but as a lawyer I recognize that the laws on the books allow a woman a certain latitude of choice on the issue. And I don't know that there's any simple answer. And certainly in some respects we've made a deal with the devil in accepting federal money, because there are mandates that come along with that money. I as a governor, I would take whatever steps I could to move to the pro-life direction, and how far we're able to move is in large part going to be based on how successful we can be in weaning ourselves away from federal money, and how successful the next governor can be in working with the legislature in order to move us in that direction.
Where do you stand on gay marriage?
Another tough issue. For me personally, it's not my lifestyle choice, but times evolve here in the United States. There was a time when interracial marriage wasn't allowed, and in fact, Idaho was one of the last states that had to be mandated before Idaho changed its law, mandated by the federal government, had to change its law and allow interracial marriage. Well, now we're at that point with gay marriage here in Idaho. Again, as a lawyer, having practiced in the courts, state and federal courts, I firmly believe that the writing's on the wall. And this next session, we're going to have the U.S. Supreme Court announce that Idaho's constitutional amendment and statute prohibiting gay marriage is unconstitutional. And that's something we're going to have to, as Idahoans, learn to deal with, just like we had to learn to deal with the interracial marriage issue.
So you feel it's a losing battle?
I think it's a losing battle. To quote the judge that heard the argument out of the Ninth Circuit, that ship has sailed.
One more question, because we have an enormous amount of people that are concerned about our gun rights and our Second Amendment rights. Where do you stand on constitutional carry? Because we've heard a lot of different tales about why we haven't been able to get that through the legislature here.
I'm surprised that Idaho isn't a constitutional carry state to begin with. In fact, I think maybe in Hawaii County they are a constitutional carry county. But there are states that are constitutional carry states, Alaska, Arizona. And they don't seem to have the problems that people worry about occurring here in Idaho if we allow us to move in that direction. I don't see the problem with constitutional carry. We have a Second Amendment right to bear arms, and I think that ought to be the license that we need and the only license we need to carry a firearm. I think, if I understand correctly from some legislators with whom I've been speaking, there's going to be another push this next session to move Idaho in that direction, and I would firmly support that move.
Very good. Is there anything else you'd like to say to kind of sum up where you are, where you're going, what's happening in your campaign?
Sure. The one thing I want to share with the voters in closing is Idaho's at a crossroads, like I said at the beginning of this meeting. And I think everybody agrees at this point that the current Republican leadership under Governor Otter is moving us in the wrong direction. And we're conservative folks here in the state of Idaho, and there are some realities that you have to face. If Idahoans go to the polls and vote for a Democrat, you're going to have A.J. Belukoff in office who's going to be absolutely unable to work with a Republican legislature. You're going to get gridlock and 4 years of no movement, 4 years of the status quo. The only way we're going to see real progress in Idaho is if the voters come out and elect a conservative leader who can work with the Republican legislature and move us in a positive direction. And as I've shared with you today, I do have a positive vision and a positive direction for the state of Idaho. And people need to get off their couches. We're Idahoans, we're fighters. And they need to fight and not just settle for the fact that they're going to have to deal with whatever the Republicans or the Democrats want to put on the table. They need to get off their couches. These independent voters who outnumber the Republicans and Democrats who are registered to vote, together, the independents outnumber those folks. If they get off the couch and they come to the polls and they cast their vote for someone who's going to bring traditional conservative Idaho values back to the State House, someone who can work with the legislature, we're going to see 4 years of real positive movement in the right direction for the people of the state of Idaho.
John, thank you very much for coming here this evening. We appreciate your time, and good luck in your campaign.
Thank you, Bob.